Well, for more on millennials in Cuba, we are joined by Baruch College professor Ted Henken. He's also the author of Cuba, a Global Studies Handbook. Thank you for joining us tonight. So you've been traveling extensively to Cuba over the past year. I want to get your take on what the sense is among millennials with Castro. I mean, here in the U.S., a lot of Cuban Americans actually cheered with his death, but we're seeing thousands of people lining up in Revolutionary Square in Havana to pay respects to the late leader. Who's lining up? Is it the older generation or younger generation of Cubans?
I think it's probably a majority older generations. I think you can there's a law of diminishing returns in terms of seeing Fidel as a fundamental force in your life. I mean, he's been a fundamental force in every Cuban's life, but I think really in terms of admiration, in terms of emotion, it's going to be felt by the grandparents, some of the parents, but few of the grandchildren, and almost none of the great-grandchildren who might be in Miami by this time.
Right, and a lot of the younger generations, I mean, are looking forward to you know, how their life is going to change. I'm assuming a lot of entrepreneurs, as we've just discussed. In general, do they want to see closer ties with the United States?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think that whereas the majority of Cuban Americans like the opening, there's still a lot who don't. Whereas in Cuba, you could talk about 95, 98% of people, because they will hope to see that it affects their pocketbooks, it affects their income, it affects the ability to have a better life in an immediate, direct way. More travel means more people on the street to sell, food to take around in your cab. So this is a hope that a lot of Cubans have. Also, Cubans, I think, really, especially the young generation, hope that the opening with the United States will reduce the ability of the Cuban government's propaganda kind of apparatus to blame everything on the United States, and it's going to have to start answering some of the complaints and the demands of the Cuban people and not say everything is the fault of Uncle Sam. So, for example, internet access, they can't blame on the embargo anymore. They're going to have to demand from the Cuban government, and the Cuban government's going to have to respond.
And speaking about internet access, these so-called hotspots, I mean, do you think that's really going to make a big difference in the lives of these young entrepreneurs? Absolutely.
I think that right now the hotspots are very expensive for Cubans. They cost $2 an hour, and Cubans make about $20 a month. Wow. So imagine that. But not every Cuban makes $20 a month, and there are some people who prioritize that because their business is based on having access to the internet. If a foreigner is flying in tomorrow and they're going to stay in your bed and breakfast, you need to know, and you need to get access to your email to figure out if they're coming tomorrow or the next day, how many people are coming, what their preferences are. So it's a business proposition. The government knows that, and the government has a monopoly over the internet, so anybody who pays to get access to the internet is paying the government, right? And so the government, I think, will open up the internet and has opened up the internet over the last 2 or 3 years significantly, although it's very, very low relative to the rest of the world. It's been increasing in Cuba. If they can make money off of it, which they are, and if they can control the side effects of it, which are independent media, criticism, dissent, and access to outside media that might question or undermine the propaganda from the government.
Okay, and then in terms of, you mentioned travel, obviously there's a huge opportunity for Cuba and young people wanting to have travel-related businesses that cater to all these tourists. But what other industries are young Cubans wanting to get into?
One of the most fascinating things that I've seen is that Cuba has a great education system that people know about around the world. Even Obama lauded it when he was in Cuba in March. They have also a great computer science university, but the graduates get out of the university and have very few options for real employment. With the government, they get paid very little, and they can't be very creative or innovative. So they have launched a lot of their own internet startups, but that aren't on the internet. They're digital startups. So one example are applications for your cell phone that function in a Cuban offline environment, but what they do is they function much like any kind of app in the United States, like OpenTable or Yelp, that would rate or give you information about a place to go eat or a place to buy a pair of shoes or a place to get your hair done. But the Cuban system, these apps are designed by Cuban engineers for the Cuban environment, so they're very light, but they have the information embedded in the phone. They can't get information from the cloud, and they also use the cell phone towers to geolocate so they can tell you where you are and where you want to go and how to get there, all offline. So it's really an amazing system where the Cubans have dreamed up ways around when there's not a way through.
And like other millennials around the world, do they also want to search for opportunity outside of Cuba, or do they want to really stay in Cuba right now? What's your sense?
My sense is that many of them realize that it's going to be very hard to have the life that they want if they remain completely in Cuba, although many of them are rolling the dice, starting these new businesses, investing their savings, getting friends to help, and they're trying it. However, what the new Cuban millennial is going to really be in the end, I think, is a transnational. They're going to be people who stay in Cuba, have a business in Cuba, have some, let's say, skin in the game in Cuba, but they're going to travel abroad once or twice a year. They're going to bring back stuff that will help. So it's going to be a different kind of a Cuban transnational.
So a lot of Cuban ties with Cuban Americans, I'm assuming, in Miami.
Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much. That was Ted Henken, professor at Baruch College and author of Cuba, a Global Studies Handbook.